The year was 1889, and the high desert of Cotton Mesa was baking under the weary, late summer sun. The heat was not a blanket. It was a weight. It pressed the red dust into the grain of the silvered fence posts and wilted the heads of the foxtail grass. A hot wind scraped across the flatlands, carrying nothing but the scent of alkali and the distant, rhythmic clang of a cattle bell. It was the only percussion in a silence so vast it felt alive. The sound, a metronome for a land that would kill a man as easily as it would cradle him. The noon stage, caked in a layer of rust-colored grime, groaned to a halt in front of the Cotton Mesa livery. From it descended Marin Calloway. She was 28. Though the trail had painted smudges of exhaustion beneath her eyes that added years, she moved with a deliberate, contained economy, retrieving her single piece of luggage, a heavy, canvas-bound trunk that held everything she owned. Marin was a seamstress by trade and a tutor by necessity, a woman drifting from one hardscrabble town to the next. She owned the clothes on her back, the needles in her sewing kit, and a secret that defined her more than any name or occupation. It was a scar, not on her skin, but etched deep inside her, left by a fever that had nearly claimed her life when she was 15. The country doctor, smelling of whiskey and stale tobacco, had spoken in hushed tones to her mother, using words like complications and barren. The fever had passed, but it had taken with it any hope of the one thing a woman in this territory was expected to provide a future, carried in the blood. The knowledge was a constant, invisible weight, pressing down on every plan she ever tried to make. She was in Cotton Mesa for the same reason she'd been in Cheyenne, and before that, Laramie. Work had dried up, and she'd heard of a rancher needing canvas mended. She adjusted the worn ribbon on her bonnet, her gaze scanning the short, dusty Main Street. He was not hard to find. Thatcher Boone stood by the smithy, signing a receipt for a provision wagon. He was 34, a man built of long angles and hard planes. His shoulders were wide enough to block the sun, and his hands, wrapped around a coil of new rope, looked capable of either breaking a horse or building a house. He was the owner of Boone Hollow, a solitary ranch nestled against the foothills. He lived there alone, had done so ever since his younger brother, Silas, had been crushed in a salt mine collapse 3 years prior. The grief had settled on him, silencing him, turning his eyes the color of the sky before a storm, a flat, impenetrable gray. Marin approached him directly. There was no room for feminine wiles in a world this harsh. It was a transaction. Mr. Boone. He turned. His gaze was not unkind, but it was heavy, like a measuring scale. He took in her dusty traveling dress, her straight spine, and the canvas trunk at her feet. "I'm Marin Calloway. I heard you had canvas work." She nodded toward the barn at the end of the street, where a huge tarp over the stockyard snapped violently in the wind, its grommets tearing loose. "I can double-stitch and reinforce that before the next storm hits. I'm looking for temporary board in exchange." Thatcher looked from the tarp back to her. He noted her hands. They were not soft. The fingers were calloused, the right index finger peppered with tiny, faded needle pricks. They were working hands. He gave a single, curt nod. "Room in the attic, board included. The wagon's heading out now." He didn't offer to take her trunk. She didn't expect him to. He loaded his supplies, and she muscled the trunk onto the buckboard herself. They sat side by side on the hard wooden seat, the rattle of the wheels and the shriek of the wind filling the space between them. They were two people of few words, surrounded by the smells of cured leather from the harness, the sharp ammonia of horse sweat, and the sweet, dry dust of the hay piled in the back. The ride to Boone Hollow was 5 miles of silence. When they arrived, Marin understood the name. The ranch was tucked into a natural depression, a hollow sheltered by cottonwoods that survived only because of the spring that fed a deep, clear creek. It was the only reliable water source for miles. As Marin wrestled her trunk onto the porch, Thatcher spoke. "Town talk is buzzin'. Seems the Silver Line Railroad is looking to push a spur through here." Marin paused, wiping sweat from her brow with her sleeve. "Railroads mean work. Railroads mean land," he corrected, his voice flat, He began unhitching the team. And they mean water. They'll want it cheap. Marin processed this as she followed him into town later that afternoon to buy the heavy-gauge thread she'd need. While she waited for the shopkeep to find it, she heard the names. They were spoken in the low, speculative tones of men in the saloon next door, the sound drifting through the thin walls. Preacher Hale and County Commissioner Broder. Hale's calling it God's providence. One man chuckled, his voice thick. Says the railroad is a holy chariot, bringing prosperity. It's Broder's prosperity I'm worried about, another voice grumbled. He's squeezing folks, using this drought as leverage, trying to get 'em to sign over land access for pennies on the dollar. Marin's blood went cool despite the heat. She looked out the window. Boone Hollow, with its deep, reliable spring, wasn't just a ranch. It was an oasis. It was the only thing that would make a railroad prosper here. They weren't just after land. They were after Thatcher Boone's water rights. When Thatcher met her back at the wagon, she mentioned the names. Commissioner Broder seems invested in this railroad. Thatcher finished tying down a sack of feed, his movements economical and precise. He dismissed it with a shake of his head. Broder's a snake, always has been, but it's just talk. Hot air from the saloon. But as he said it, Marin saw his jaw tighten. When he spoke the name Broder, his eyes lost their stormy quality and went flat, hard, and cold as iron. He knew the name, and the knowing was not simple. As they neared the turnoff to Boone Hollow, Marin saw a flash of color on the weathered fence line. It was a small, faded blue ribbon, tied neatly around the top rail. It looked absurdly delicate against the rough, splintered wood. "Vandals?" she asked. Thatcher didn't slow the wagon. "Poppy Lane." The name hung in the air. Marin waited. "She's from the orphanage in town," he said, his voice softer, almost rough. "The one run by the church. Their well is mostly alkali. She leaves those, asking for water for their vegetable garden." "Do you give it?" "I leave a barrel by the gate. The matron picks it up. The child doesn't need to be begging." His tone was clipped, embarrassed by the admission of charity. Marin looked back at the ribbon, a small, silent plea. Later that evening, while Thatcher was in the barn, Marin walked to the main gate. She carried a small bucket of clean water from the house pump and poured it carefully onto the patch of struggling sunflowers Poppy had planted just outside the fence. She retied the ribbon, securing it against the wind. It was her first quiet act of defiance, the first thread she'd sewn into the fabric of this place. Thatcher showed her to the attic room. The stairs were steep and narrow. The room itself was clean but stark, tucked under the eaves. It smelled of old pine, lye soap, and disuse. A narrow iron bed frame was covered with a single, coarse wool blanket. The one window, propped open with a stick, looked out over the ranch and toward the distant, jagged line of the ridge of sorrel. The house wasn't just quiet, it was hollow. The stillness was so profound that it had a sound, a low hum of emptiness. Marin realized this was what a house sounded like when it had been occupied by only one person, and his grief. For too long. "It'll do," she said, setting her trunk down. "Supper's at 7, he replied, and left her. That night, the house settled around her. Marin couldn't sleep. The wool blanket was rough against her skin, and the wind moaned under the eaves. By the light of a small tallow candle, she opened her sewing kit. She didn't work on the tarp. That was for daylight. Instead, she took a piece of soft buckskin she'd been saving and began stitching a small, sturdy pouch, something to hold pencils or chalk. She thought of Poppy Lane's small hands on the fence. From outside, beyond her open window, she could hear two sounds. From town, miles away, came the faint, tinny plucking of a banjo, someone fumbling through a tune and missing half the notes, and from the porch directly below, the rhythmic creak of a rocking chair. She looked down. Thatcher Boone was sitting in the dark, his feet propped on the railing. He was smoking a pipe. She could not see his face. Only the silhouette of his broad shoulders against the night sky and the single glowing red ember of the tobacco in the pipe's bowl. It flared bright as he drew on it, then dimmed, a tiny, hot coal guarding the entrance to a heart that had been sealed shut. She felt a sudden, sharp kinship with him. She, with her empty future, he, with his empty house. She pulled her thin shawl tighter and walked downstairs, padding softly onto the porch. The floorboards creaked, announcing her. He didn't turn his head, but the rocking stopped. They stood in the silence for a long time, the only light coming from the oil lamp she'd left burning on the kitchen table inside. The out-of-tune banjo had finally given up. Marin spoke first, the words slipping out into the darkness, quiet and unadorned. "I don't have anyone?" He was still, staring out at the ridge. He took the pipe from his mouth, tapping the ash onto the dusty ground. The red ember vanished. "Neither do I." His voice was low, rough, like gravel. It wasn't an invitation. It wasn't a lament. It was a statement of fact, as solid and unyielding as the land around them. It was the first real thing either of them had said. Acknowledgement. Two solitary figures, standing just far enough apart for the lamplight to barely touch them both. Their shared loneliness, a sudden, brittle thing in the vast, indifferent dark. The mended canvas tarp now cast a solid, sharp-edged shadow across the hard pan of the stockyard. Inside the barn, Marin Calloway had created a different kind of sanctuary. It was, she had to admit, the cleanest barn she had ever occupied. It smelled less of manure and more of cured hay, cedar shavings, and the dry, earthy scent of the packed dirt floor that Thatcher Boone swept clean every morning. In this borrowed space, school was in session. Marin had tacked a wide, smooth plank of pine between two support beams. With a piece of precious white chalk, she drew letters. Her students were a small, motley bunch. Poppy Lane, her 8-year-old face drawn with a seriousness that didn't belong to her, sat on a hay bale, her bare feet tucked beneath her. Beside her sat the Miller twins, Eli and Asa, their faces perpetually smudged with soot from their father's work at the defunct salt mine. "The letter is B," Marin said, her voice clear and patient, cutting through the heavy afternoon heat. The chalk squeaked, a high, thin sound, like Boone, or barn, or bread. Poppy traced the letter in the dust on her own knee. From the far end of the barn, in the shadows of the smithy, Thatcher worked. He was repairing a bridle. The rhythmic snick of his leather punch the only sound accompanying her lesson. Marin was aware of him, as one is aware of a large, quiet animal. He never interrupted, never offered a word, but he was always there. Yesterday, he had appeared at the barn opening, a silhouette against the blinding sun. He said nothing, simply placed a fresh tin bucket of water from the spring on a stump near the children, a dipper hanging from its side. The water was so cold it fogged the metal. Marin had nodded her thanks. He had merely dipped his chin in reply and returned to the farrier's anvil. This morning, they had arrived to find he had erected a small shade awning at the barn's wide entrance, using a spare piece of canvas and 2 new poles. The sun was shifting, and the patch of shade it provided was exactly where the children sat. He hadn't asked, he had just observed, and then acted. Marin looked at the posts. The nails were driven straight, each head perfectly flush with the wood. It was a statement more articulate than any "you're welcome" could have been. This quiet, functioning rhythm was broken by the arrival of a buggy. It was black and well-sprung, and the man who stepped down from it was just as sleek. Preacher Hale was a man whose smiles never reached his eyes. He wiped his polished boots on the mat by the farmhouse door before striding to the barn, his black broadcloth coat absorbing the light. "A blessing," he boomed, his voice too large for the space. "Sister Marin, you are doing the Lord's work, bringing enlightenment to these little ones." Marin rose slowly, instinctively moving to stand between him and the children. "We are just practicing letters, preacher." "Indeed, indeed." Hale's gaze slid right past her, past the children, past the pine plank blackboard. His eyes, small and quick, were on the water. He noted the full troughs for the stock. He scanned the line of the irrigation ditch that fed Thatcher's small alfalfa field. He measured, with a practiced eye, the steady, generous flow coming from the spring-fed creek. He was a man counting another's coin. "Mister, Boone is truly blessed," Hale said, his eyes still on the flowing water. "To be such a steward of God's bounty in this dry season, it is a season for sharing. Is it not a season for community?" From the shadows, Thatcher's voice came, flat and cold as a shovel blade. "The stock gets what it needs. Preacher." Hale's smile tightened. Of course. He tipped his hat to Marin, his gaze lingering on her for a moment, sharp and assessing, before he returned to his buggy. The preacher's visit was followed 2 days later by the politicians. Commissioner Broder did not come in a buggy. He rode a fine-looking sorrel, and he didn't bother with the farmhouse. He rode directly to the fence line where Thatcher was replacing a rotted post. Broder was a hearty man, thick in the middle, with a vest that strained at its buttons and a voice oiled with false familiarity. "Thatcher, my boy, working yourself to the bone, as always." Thatcher didn't stop his work, just braced the new post. "Broder, now, Thatcher, I've come as a friend. This place." Broder gestured to the ranch, the house, the hills. "It's a lot for one man, a heavy burden with all this responsibility." He nodded toward the creek. "The Silver Line is expanding. They're authorized by the county by me to make you a very generous offer. Cash, Thatcher, enough to liberate you from all this." Thatcher set a railroad spike on top of the post. He lifted his sledgehammer. "Liberate. Exactly sell the land. Take the money. Go east. See the world. You've earned it." Thatcher stared at the spike. He said nothing for a long moment. Then, he lifted the hammer high and brought it down in a perfect, powerful arc. The thud of steel on the steel echoed in the dry air. "Water goes with the land," Thatcher said, his voice low, vibrating with the impact. He lifted the hammer again. Thud. "Land goes with memory." He swung a final time. Thud. The spike was driven deep. He rested the hammer, his knuckles white. "It's not for sale." Broder's hearty expression dissolved. His face went cold. "You're making a mistake. Boone, you can't stand in the way of progress. It'll roll right over you. Get off my property, Broder." Broder spat a stream of tobacco juice into the dust, dangerously close to Thatcher's boot. He wheeled his sorrel around and galloped off, leaving a cloud of red dust. That evening, Marin felt a chill. The attic room was proving to be a reservoir for the day's heat, but a different kind of cold had settled on her. She felt the net tightening around Boone Hollow, and by extension, around her and the children. She was tidying her small space, folding the coarse blanket at the foot of her bed, when her foot caught on a loose floorboard. Curious, she knelt and worked her fingers under the edge. It lifted easily. Beneath it was a small, dark hollow, and inside that, a cracked leather satchel. It was not hers. It must have belonged to Thatcher's family. She hesitated, feeling like an intruder, but the encounter with Broder pushed her forward. Inside were old, brittle papers, tax receipts from the 1860s, a bill of sale for a bull, and, at the bottom, a hand-drawn map on yellowed linen. It wasn't a surveyor's map of property lines. It was a map of the water. It showed the spring, the main creek, and several smaller tributaries, all marked with hand-inked arrows showing the flow. But it was the notes in the corner that made her breath catch. In faded brown ink, a strong hand had written, "Stone markers set, claim filed, W.R. Boone, 1864, W.R.R." Marin had spent enough time in land offices and county courthouses to know water right, a claim of prior appropriation first in time, first in right, a claim staked and filed long before the county, and men like Broder had taken an interest in organizing and controlling such things. She traced the letters with her finger. This was what they were after. This piece of paper was the true deed to Boone Hollow, and she guessed, from Broder's aggressive offer, that he believed this document was either lost or non-existent. The next afternoon, Poppy was quiet. She sat on her hay bale, staring at the bee on the board. But her eyes were unfocused. During a short recess, Marin sat beside her, offering her a piece of dried apple from her own small stash. "What is it, Poppy?" Marin asked softly. Poppy's lower lip trembled. She whispered, "Preacher Hale told Matron, we're being dissolved. Dissolved the orphanage. He said we ain't got valid sponsorship no more." A tear escaped, tracing a clean line through the dust on her cheek. "He said the county's gonna take us." Matron was crying. She said the railroad has a workhouse for orphans. She said they make 'em apprentice. Marin's blood ran cold. It was a trap, elegant in its cruelty. Hale, as the church authority, declares the orphanage non-viable. Broder, as the county commissioner, seizes the children as wards of the state. He then charitably apprentices them to the Silver Line, providing the railroad with a source of cheap, indentured labor. It was all perfectly legal, and it was monstrous. That night, Marin couldn't sew. She sat on her narrow bed, the map resting in her lap, and stared out the window at the ridge of sorrel. The memory, the one she kept locked away, surfaced with a painful clarity. She was 15. The fever had been a fire, burning for weeks. She remembered the strange, sweet smell of the laudanum they gave her, and the cold, wet cloths on her forehead. When the fire finally broke, the doctor, a weary man with kind eyes and whiskey on his breath, had spoken to her mother in the hallway. Marin had heard the muffled words. "The fever settled bad, ma'am. I'm afraid the damage is done. She'll live, but her future as a mother, it's not likely at all." A door had closed. For years, she had felt hollowed out, defined by that lack. But as she sat there, the weight of Poppy's fear settling on her, something shifted. She looked at the chalk dust still staining her fingers. A new, fierce resolve hardened inside her. If she could not nurture with blood, she would nurture with letters. If she could not give children life, she would give them a future. She would teach them to read the contracts Broder would have them sign. She would arm them with the one thing that could set them free. She would mother them with arithmetic and the alphabet. The next day, a flicker of light broke the tension. The lesson was on animals. Marin drew a poor approximation of a horse. Thatcher's big gray gelding, Saltjack, was tethered just outside the barn door, swishing his tail. One of the miners' boys, Asa, dropped his piece of chalk. It rolled into the dust near the horse's feet. Saltjack, ever curious, lowered his massive head to investigate. He blew a soft, inquiring snort. A small cloud of white chalk dust erupted, puffing up to coat the horse's dark, velvety nose in a perfect white circle. Poppy, startled, let out a single, sharp giggle. It was a sound as bright and unexpected as a wildflower in the dust. Marin looked over at Thatcher, who was leaning on the barn door, watching. A sound came from his chest. It wasn't a laugh. It was too rough, too unused. It was a short, low chuckle, cut off almost as soon as it started, as if he were surprised by the very mechanics of it. But it was there. Marin heard it, and the sound landed on her heart like a validation, like the first crack in a long frozen river. That evening, the oppressive heat finally broke. A cold drizzle began to fall, whispering against the farmhouse roof. The air turned damp and smelled of dust and wet pine. Thatcher came in from his last rounds, shrugging out of his heavy canvas work coat. It was dark with rain. He hung it on a peg by the stove, where it immediately began to steam. Marin, tidying the kitchen after their silent supper, noticed the seam at his right shoulder was pulling apart, the threads frayed. "That won't last another storm," she said, her voice practical. He grunted, running a hand through his damp hair. He sat at the table to clean a piece of harness tack, his broad back to her. Marin fetched her sewing kit. "Hold still," she said, more as a statement than a request. She stood beside him, the lamplight falling over his shoulder. The coat was still on him, as it was too wet to work with on the table. She pulled the heavy needle and waxed thread. The only sounds in the room were the hiss of the rain, the soft clink of the harness buckle in Thatcher's hands, and the quiet shush of her thread pulling through the thick, damp canvas. She worked quickly, her fingers deft. He sat unnaturally still, his shoulder rigid under her hands. To get the right angle for the final knot, she had to brace her left hand against his back while her right pushed the needle through. Just as she finished, he shifted, turning to reach for a rag, the needle still in her grip. Glanced off her thimble and pricked the back of his hand. A tiny, perfect bead of dark blood welled up on his skin. "Ah," he breathed, a sharp intake of air. "I'm sorry," she murmured, pulling back instantly. "It's nothing." But before he could wipe it away, she instinctively reached out. She pressed her thumb against the small wound. It was a gesture meant to stop the bleeding. Simple as that, but it was not simple. His skin was rough, calloused, and shockingly warm. Her own fingers were calloused from the needle, but her touch was gentle. The contact was electric. It was a tiny point of pressure in the vast, quiet room. He froze. She froze. Their eyes met. His, no longer stormy, were dark and wide, unguarded for a single, skipped heartbeat. She snatched her hand back as if burned. He pulled his own, turning it over to look at the tiny red mark. "The seam is done," Marin said, her voice suddenly too loud. She quickly packed her needle away, her hands not quite steady. Thatcher cleared his throat, returning his attention to the harness with a furious, unnecessary energy. "Thank you." An hour passed. The rain fell harder. Marin was reading her small Bible at the table. Thatcher was staring into the cold stove. Then, a new sound cut through the night. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't the rain. It was the church bell. It wasn't the slow, melodic call to worship. It was ringing fast, frantic, and demanding. Clang, 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 clang. It was an alarm. Thatcher was on his feet in an instant, moving to the dark window, peering toward the distant, flickering lights of Cotton Mesa. "That's hail," he said, and his voice was flat, hard iron again. The brief thaw from the barn, the moment of shared breath by the stove, was gone. Marin joined him, her heart thumping in time with the bell. "A fire." "No." Thatcher turned from the window, his face a mask of shadows. "He's calling that meeting, the one for the Silver Line Welfare Fund." He reached for the coat she had just mended, the seam now strong and tight. "He's done asking." The Blue Lantern Saloon was not built for sermons, but Preacher Hale was making it serve. The emergency meeting had spilled out of the small church and the saloon. Being the only other building in Cotton Mesa large enough to hold the populace, was pressed into service. The air was thick with the smell of spilled whiskey, sweat, and a sharp, crackling fear. Kerosene lamps cast greasy, yellow shadows on the anxious faces of ranchers, miners, and shopkeepers. Preacher Hale stood on a platform of stacked beer barrels, his black coat making him a pillar of shadow against the bright lamps. Commissioner Broder, looking more like a banker than a politician, stood beside him, a sheaf of papers in his hand. "Prosperity," Hale's voice boomed, rich and practiced, silencing the nervous murmuring. "The Lord has tested us with this drought. He has baked our soil and dried our creek beds. And now, He sends us a chariot of iron. The Silver Line Railroad is not just an engine of commerce, my friends. It is an engine of salvation." A few hopeful amens scattered through the crowd. "The railroad asks for very little," Hale continued, his arms spreading wide. "It asks only for what we can spare. It asks for a temporary donation of water access, so that the engines of progress may build a new, prosperous future for us all, to bring jobs for our miners, customers for our merchants, a new life for Cotton Mesa." Commissioner Broder stepped forward, his voice a practical, reassuring rumble after Hale's fire. "This is a simple formality. Folks, a pledge of community support. Just a temporary measure to get the survey crews through this dry season. Just one dry season." He and two of his men began moving through the crowd, handing out the papers and pencils. "Just sign at the bottom. A show of good faith. A sign that Cotton Mesa is ready to join the future." Marin Calloway stood near the back, her hands clasped tightly in front of her, She watched Thatcher Boone, who leaned against a support beam, his face impassive, his arms crossed over his chest. He looked like a man made of stone, observing a flood he couldn't stop. Men were looking at the papers. Confused, they looked at their neighbors, seeking guidance. The pencils felt heavy in their hands. Marin's voice, clear and steady, cut through the saloon's thick air. "Commissioner Broder." Every head turned. A woman speaking at a town meeting was unusual. A new woman speaking was an event. Broder stopped, his smile faltering for a second. "How?" Marin asked, her gaze unwavering. "Does the silver line define temporary?" A nervous titter went through the room. Broder looked to Hale. The preacher smiled, a wide, indulgent expression, as if speaking to a child. "Temporary, my dear young woman," he chuckled, a sound like dry leaves skittering on a floor. "Why, that is God's temporary. It could be a year, it could be a lifetime. It all depends on your faith in His plan." The answer was slick, meaningless, and terrifying. It meant forever. The crowd's murmur turned colder, more uncertain. Broder, seeing his momentum lost, moved to regain it. He pointed a thick finger directly at the stone-like figure by the beam. "Thatcher Boone, your ranch is the most blessed in this valley. You have water when the rest of us have dust. Step forward. Be the tame Scanion, the good neighbor. Set the example for the rest of these good folks." The saloon went utterly silent. Every eye locked on Thatcher. He was the anchor of the valley. If Boone Hollow, with its legendary spring, signed over its water, everyone else would fall like dominoes. Thatcher did not move from his post. He slowly uncrossed his arms. He looked past Broder, past Hale, his gaze sweeping over the anxious faces of his neighbors, the men he'd known all his life. Finally, his eyes found Marin's in the back of the room. In that look, a silent, complex message passed. She saw his isolation, his burden. He saw her, standing firm, having given him the one question that mattered. She gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. It wasn't encouragement. It was acknowledgement. "You are not crazy. You see the trap." Thatcher turned his gaze back to Broder. He spoke, his voice low and carrying in the hush. "No." A collective breath was drawn. "No," Broder sputtered. "Boone, you can't." "I won't sign," Thatcher said, his voice flat. "And I'd advise the rest of you to read the fine print before you sign away your children's future for a temporary promise." He pushed off the beam and began to walk toward the door. The crowd parted for him, a wave of uncertainty and newfound doubt in his wake. As he passed Marin, he did not look at her, but said in a low voice, "We're leaving." Marin followed him out into the cooling, damp air. The meeting behind them erupted into angry, confused shouts. They were hitching their wagon in front of the general store when a large freight wagon, pulled by a 6-mule team, rumbled to a stop in front of the deputy's office. The words, "Silver Line Freight," were stenciled in stark black paint on its canvas side. Deputy Clive Morrow, a man who wore his badge with a little too much pride, emerged from his office. He was a younger man, with a weak chin and eyes that never quite met yours. The freight driver, a hard case in a trail-worn duster, handed him a clipboard with an invoice. "That's the last of it, Deputy," the driver said, loud enough for Marin to hear from across the street. "Hardware, blasting powder, and the special supplies for Commissioner Broder." Morrow, ignoring the implication, signed the paper with a flourish. "It's all county business. Approved." Marin watched, her eyes narrowing. She was standing in the shadow of her own wagon, ostensibly checking a harness strap. The freight driver took the signed invoice and stamped it with a heavy, ink-soaked press. Whump! Marin saw the mark. It left a black, circular stamp, official and stark. "How many crates?" Morrow asked, rocking back on his heels. 20 crates this run," the driver said. "Makes 42 total for the welfare fund, just like the invoice says." Morrow laughed. "A lot of welfare." He slapped the side of a crate marked with a symbol Marin didn't recognize. Marin's mind, trained to count stitches and measure fabric, filed the numbers away. 42 crates, black stamp, welfare fund. It felt wrong, like a seam stitched with rotten thread. As they prepared to climb onto the wagon, a small, desperate sound came from the alley between the saloon and the livery. "Leave it. It's just trash," a rough voice barked. It was Poppy Lane. She was cornered against the livery wall by two of Broder's men, the same ones who had been handing out the pledge sheets. She was clutching something to her chest. "What is it? Girl stealing," one of them said, grabbing her shoulder. "It's just my ribbon," Poppy cried, her voice thin with terror. "It's for the fence." She was holding a small, faded scrap of blue ribbon, the one Marin had retied at the Boone Hollow gate. The man laughed, a cruel, sharp sound. "Ribbons. You ain't got time for ribbons." With a casual, almost bored motion, he shoved her. Poppy, small and underweight, stumbled hard against the rough-hewn wall and fell into the dusty street, landing hard on her hands and knees. The man didn't even look back, just laughed again and followed his partner back toward the saloon. Poppy didn't cry out. She just knelt in the dust, her small shoulders shaking, clutching the dirty ribbon. Before Marin could even move, Thatcher was there. He had crossed the street in 3 long strides, his face a thundercloud. He didn't run, he moved, a wave of contained fury. He knelt in front of Poppy, his large, calloused hands surprisingly gentle as he touched her arm. "You hurt, child." His voice was a low rumble. Poppy looked up, her face streaked with dirt, tears welling as the shock wore off and the pain set in. She shook her head, but then winced, lifting her right knee. Her thin cotton stocking was torn, and beneath it, a raw, bloody scrape oozed red into the dust. Thatcher's jaw clamped so hard a muscle jumped. His eyes, the color of a winter storm, lifted and tracked the 2 men disappearing into the saloon. Marin saw a coldness in that look that made her shiver. It was the look of a man capable of breaking things. But he didn't move. He looked back at the child, slowly, with a gentleness that seemed almost painful for him. He slid one arm under her back and the other beneath her bleeding knee. He lifted her as if she weighed nothing, as he held her, cradling her against his chest. He looked down at the bright blood welling on her skin. His face, which had been a mask of rage, suddenly crumpled. Just for a second, his eyes closed, and he breathed in sharply. He whispered one word, so low Marin almost didn't hear it. It wasn't meant for her, or even for Poppy. "Sorry." It was a word heavy with 1,000 other meanings. It was for her knee. It was for his brother in the salt mine. It was for the years he had spent letting the Broders and Hales of the world rot his town from the inside out. He carried Poppy to the wagon and set her gently on the seat. Marin, her sewing kit already in hand, climbed up beside her. "I have bandages. Poppy, we'll fix this." The ride back to Boone Hollow was silent, save for Poppy's occasional, muffled sniffle. Thatcher drove the team hard, his knuckles white on the reins. That night, after Poppy was cleaned, bandaged and fed, and had fallen into an exhausted sleep in a bed Marin made for her on a cot near the kitchen stove, the house felt charged. The quiet was no longer empty. It was full of unsaid words, of simmering anger. Marin couldn't rest. The image of Poppy's blood, the sight of Broder's pledge sheets, the sound of Hale's voice, all swirled in her mind, driven by an instinct she couldn't name. She took her lamp and went back to the attic. She pulled the loose floorboard and took out the cracked leather satchel. She was no longer just a guest. She was a participant. She spread the old papers on her narrow bed. The map. W.R. Boone, 1864. It was a claim, but Broder was pushing a county measure. A claim from 1864 might not stand up against a 1889 county resolution, especially if the original filing was lost. She dug deeper. Her fingers brushed against a folded document, thicker than the others. It wasn't a map. It wasn't a receipt. It was a reconciliation agreement. She unfolded it carefully. The paper was brittle. The ink faded to brown. It was dated 1864, just like the map. It was an agreement between Cyrus Boone Thatcher's father and the newly formed county of Cotton Mesa. It detailed a dispute over the very creek that fed the ranch. The county had wanted to dam it. Cyrus had fought them. Marin scanned the dense, spidery script, her heart pounding. And then she found it. Clause 4. In recognition of Cyrus Boone's prior claim and as a permanent resolution. The county agrees that all water rights originating from the Boone Hollow Spring remain with the property in perpetuity. Furthermore, in times of declared drought, said water rights. Marin held the lamp closer, her finger tracing the words. Said water rights shall not be subject to county appropriation, nor shall they be transferred, leased, or otherwise encumbered, even temporarily. Marin sat back, the paper trembling in her hand. Even temporarily. The exact word Broder had used. Thatcher's father had fought this same fight, and he had won. He had seen a man like Broder coming, even 25 years ago. This was the bullet for their gun. But as she looked at it, a cold realization hit her. It was a copy, a good one, made by a clerk, but it lacked the one thing that would make it ironclad in a frontier court, the original, embossed county seal. Without that seal, Broder would laugh and call it a forgery. They needed the original. They needed the official stamp. Marin's mind raced, pulling at threads of memory. A county clerk's office, a new seal being delivered, a young woman, practicing her neat, perfect cursive on a scrap of paper. Cheyenne, before she'd come to Cotton Mesa. She'd spent a year in Cheyenne, working as a seamstress. In the same boarding house, there had been another girl, quiet, ambitious, with the most beautiful handwriting Marin had ever seen. She was studying to be a county registrar. Her name was Jeannie Drum. Marin had heard just last month that Jeannie had gotten the position. Not in Cheyenne, in a smaller, quieter county, where she could be the head clerk. Cotton Mesa. Jeannie Drum was the county clerk. She would have access to the vault. She would know where the 1864 ledgers were kept. It was a thread. It was thin, frayed, but it was the only one they had. She went downstairs. Thatcher was on the porch, staring out into the night, the pipe in his hand long since cold. The rain had stopped, but the air was heavy, humid, and electric. She stepped out onto the porch, the document in her hand. "Thatcher, I found something." He took the paper, moved into the slice of light from the kitchen lamp, and read it. He read it twice. The paper shook, just slightly, in his big hand. He looked up at her, his storm-gray eyes unreadable. "They knew," he whispered. "Broder and Hale. They knew this existed and they tried to bury it. They can't bury it if we have the original," Marin said, "or the original seal to prove it." He looked at her, a long, searching look. The anger in his face was warring with a deep, profound weariness. "Why?" he asked, his voice rough. "This isn't your fight. Marin, you mended the tarp. You're free to go. Broder's a snake, but he's a county snake. You get in his way. He'll bite. Why risk it?" Marin looked away from him, out toward the dark, jagged line of the ridge of sorrel. The air was so still. She could smell the dry grass, the ozone from the coming storm, the faint scent of wet cedar from the porch rails. She spoke to the darkness. "When I was 15, I had a fever. When it broke, the doctor told my mother that my body was broken, that I could never—" She swallowed, the admission a stone in her throat. "I could never have what a woman is supposed to dream of, a family, my own children." She turned back to him. His face was a mask of shadows, but she could feel his stillness, his absolute attention. "I've already lost that," she said, her voice quiet but fierce as steel. "I've got nothing for them to take that way, but Poppy, those children at the orphanage, they are the future. I won't stand by and watch Broder and Hale cut them up and sell them for parts to their railroad. I won't let them take more from someone else." Thatcher stared at her, his entire being locked on her face. He saw the truth of her, the old scar she carried, and the new strength it had forged. He saw a loneliness that matched his own, but hers had turned outward, into a shield, while his had turned inward, into a prison. A warm gust of wind, a precursor to the real storm, swept across the porch, carrying the scent of dry hay. It blew a strand of her dark hair across her cheek, sticking it there, without thinking. Driven by an impulse he hadn't felt in years, he lifted his hand. He reached, his calloused, rough fingers moving to brush the hair from her face. He stopped. His fingers hovered an inch from her skin. He could feel the heat of her. He could see the faint pulse in her throat. He saw her eyes widen, not in fear, but in surprise. The boundary. He was a man of fences, of lines. He had built a fortress around himself, and he was suddenly terrified of crossing hers. He slowly, deliberately, pulled his hand back, clenching it into a fist at his side. "Jeannie Drum," Marin said, her voice a little breathless, breaking the spell. "She's the new county clerk. I knew her, in Cheyenne. I think she might help us." Thatcher nodded, his throat tight. He looked away, up at the sky, on the far horizon, beyond the ridge of Sorrel. The clouds pulsed with a sudden, silent light, a flash of heat lightning, illuminating the edges of the massive storm front that was rolling toward them. It was a sign. The dry season was about to break, and all the secrets, all the carefully laid plans buried in the dust of Cotton Mesa, were about to be exposed. They left before the first hint of dawn, when the air was still cool and smelled of stone and night-blooming flowers. Thatcher saddled his powerful gray gelding, Saltjack, and the calmer, sturdy mare, Mossy Belle, for Marin. As Marin adjusted her stirrups, a small figure darted from the shadows of the porch. It was Poppy. She pressed something into Marin's hand. "For luck," she whispered, her voice husky with sleep. "So it gets mended." It was the faded blue ribbon. Marin's throat tightened. She carefully tucked the scrap of silk into the deep pocket of her riding skirt. "I'll bring it back," she promised. The child nodded, a solemn, trusting gesture that felt heavier than any legal document, and then scurried back to the warmth of the house. They rode in silence, pushing the horses hard. Their plan was to take the direct trail through Coyote Cut, a narrow, rocky pass that would shave a day off the journey to Cheyenne. The land was stark, a study in shades of ochre and gray, the silence broken only by the rhythmic clopping of hooves and the creak of saddle leather. They reached the entrance to the cut as the sun climbed higher, beating down on them, and stopped. The pass was blocked. Two massive pinyon pines, their needles still green and fragrant, had been felled to lay directly across the trail. It was no accident of nature. The cuts were fresh, the sawdust bright against the dark bark. Thatcher dismounted, his face grim. He walked the perimeter of the roadblock, his eyes scanning the ground. Marin followed. The signs were as clear as a printed page. Wide, deep-set ruts from a heavy, six-mule freight wagon, the same kind she'd seen in town. "Silverline," Thatcher said, his voice flat. He pointed to a set of hoof prints alongside the wagon tracks. And a single rider, shod horse, moving fast. "Clive Morrow," Marin said, the name tasting like ash. He went ahead. "To warn them we were coming, or to make sure there was nothing to find when we got there," Thatcher added. He looked at the blocked pass, then at the steep, treacherous slopes on either side. There was no way through. "He's just added a day to our ride." The detour took them south, into the harsh, broken country of the Badlands. It was a longer, harder trail, with less water and more sun. By the time dusk began to purple the eastern sky, they were exhausted, and Cheyenne was still a hard day's ride away. They had to make camp. Thatcher found a shallow alcove carved by wind and time into the side of a sandstone butte. It wasn't a cave, more of a deep overhang, but it would offer shelter from the wind and hide their small fire. He unsaddled the horses and hobbled them in a patch of sparse buffalo grass while Marin gathered twigs for kindling. They shared a meager meal of jerky and hardtack, washed down with water from their canteens. As true darkness fell, a profound cold seeped out of the stone. The temperature dropped 20 degrees in an hour. Thatcher unstrapped the single, heavy wool bedroll from behind his saddle. He spread it on the smoothest patch of ground. They looked at it, then at each other. There was only one. "You take it," he said. "I'll take first watch. We'll both freeze," Marin stated, her voice practical, betraying none of the sudden, awkward tension that had sprung up between them. "We share it, fully clothed. We'll be warmer." It was a sensible solution, the only one, yet it felt momentous. He hesitated for only a second before giving a curt nod. She lay down first, pulling her shawl tight, facing the rock wall. He took the outside, stretching out with his back to hers, his rifle lying on the ground beside him. The space between them was a chasm of unspoken rules and self-respect. They did not touch. But in the immense, silent dark of the Badlands, the simple proximity was a shock to two people so accustomed to being alone. Marin could feel the heat radiating from his body. She could hear the soft, steady rhythm of his breathing, so close to her own. It was a foreign sound, a human anchor in the vast, uncaring wilderness. She lay awake for a long time, listening to that sound and the lonely chirp of the crickets, acutely aware of the solid, living presence just inches from her own. She awoke to a low, earth-shaking rumble. The sky was pale with the first light of dawn. Thatcher was already awake, standing at the edge of the alcove, motionless. He put a finger to his lips. "Bison," he whispered. Marin rose and moved to stand beside him. Below them, stretching for a mile across the plain, a river of dark, shaggy bodies was flowing north, hundreds of them. The air vibrated with their passage, a primal, magnificent sight that made the world feel new and ancient at the same time. The rising sun caught the dust kicked up by their hooves, turning it into a golden halo. Marin, captivated, stepped onto a loose, flat rock at the edge of the overhang to get a better view. The stone shifted under her weight. She lost her balance, a small cry escaping her as she flailed. An arm shot out. Thatcher didn't grab her. His large hand came down, firm and steady, on her shoulder, his fingers pressing into the thick fabric of her dress. It was not a violent or a desperate gesture. It was a quiet, solid anchor. He simply held her there, preventing her fall, his touch radiating a surprising warmth that cut through the morning chill. "Easy," he said, his voice a low rumble close to her ear. The weight of his hand was immense. It was heavy, protective, and utterly sure. Her heart gave a sudden, hard thump against her ribs, a jolt that had nothing to do with her near fall. He held her for a second longer than necessary, long enough for the moment to register. Then he removed his hand, but she could still feel the imprint of it on her shoulder. They reached Cheyenne late that afternoon, covered in a film of red dust, their face drawn with exhaustion. The county courthouse was an imposing brick building, the grandest structure Marin had ever seen. The clerk's office was a hushed, orderly world of dark wood and the smell of ink and old paper. A woman with hair pinned in a severe but perfect bun looked up from a massive ledger. It was Jeannie Drum. She was older, more poised, but the same intelligent, cautious eyes looked back at Marin. Marin Calloway." Jeannie's professional mask slipped, replaced by a flicker of genuine surprise. "Hello, Jeannie. It's been a long time." After a brief, hushed explanation, Jeannie's face grew serious. She led them from the public office into the archives, a windowless room lined with shelves of leather-bound ledgers. She took Marin's copy of the 1864 Reconciliation Agreement, her fingers tracing the faded script. "I remember seeing this entry," she murmured, pulling a heavy book from a shelf. Volume 1, 1864. She ran a finger down the index. "Here, Boone, Cyrus, Water Rights Reconciliation." She confirmed it. The agreement was real, officially recorded. A wave of relief washed over Marin. "We need the original, Jeannie," Thatcher said, his voice low. "Or at least an official copy with the county seal." Jeannie's face tightened. "That's in the vault." She disappeared into a small room with a heavy iron door and returned a few minutes later, her expression pale. "It's gone," she said, her voice a whisper. "What do you mean, gone?" Thatcher demanded. "The file is here," Jeannie said, holding up a thin folder. "But the embossed seal, the official die press for that year, It's been checked out. She looked nervously toward the office door. It was signed out 2 days ago, right after the new county drought resolution was passed. By who? Marin asked, though she already knew the answer. Jeannie leaned closer, her voice barely audible. Preacher Hale. He came in, quoting scripture about preserving our history. He said he needed to make a certified copy for the church archives. He took the whole file, seal and all. I thought it was strange, but he had a signed order from Commissioner Broder. She wrung her hands. He brought the file back, but I didn't think to check for the seal itself. He must have kept it. Marin, they're planning something. Broder is preparing to make a public announcement. I overheard him talking about presenting a true and accurate copy of the Boone Agreement to the public, one that proves Thatcher's claim is invalid. A forgery. They had created a forged document, omitting Clause 4, and were preparing to legitimize it with the stolen original seal. It was a dead end. Thatcher's face was like granite. He looked defeated. But Marin's mind was racing, connecting threads. A seamstress sees the whole garment, not just the cloth. Seals, she said aloud. Jeannie, back then, a man's official mark, his seal, it wasn't just for paper. Was it for important claims, for property? They'd have it stamped on other things, wouldn't they, to prove ownership? Jeannie frowned in thought. Sometimes, the blacksmith's registries might show it. If a man commissioned a custom die, it would be recorded. A blacksmith, Thatcher said, a flicker of something returning to his eyes. They found the Pike Son smithy in the oldest part of town. It was a cavern of soot and shadows. Owen Pike was a man who seemed to have been forged from the same iron he worked, his hands gnarled and powerful. He didn't remember the name Cyrus Boone at first. So many ranchers, he grumbled, wiping his hands on an oily rag. He was meticulous, Thatcher said, his voice quiet. Never left a job half-finished, always checked every nail, every weld himself. The old blacksmith's eyes narrowed in memory. Cyrus Boone. I remember him now. A hard man, but fair. He paid in silver dollars, not promises. Pike tapped his temple. He commissioned a die punch, custom, a B with a W and an R tucked inside it, and the year, 1864. Unusual design. I remember the work. What was it for? Marin asked, her heart hammering. Said he wanted to mark his water barrels, Pike said, a slow smile cracking his sooty face. The big oak ones he used to haul water up to the salt mine crews. Said he didn't trust paper. Said a fire could burn a courthouse down, but iron remembers. Where would those barrels be now? Thatcher pressed. Pike shrugged. Long gone, I reckon. That mine's been closed for years. If any of that old gear is left, it'd be rotting in the old storage depot behind the mine works. The ride back was a desperate, punishing race against the coming storm. A fine, cold drizzle began to fall, plastering their hair to their faces and turning the dust to a slick, red mud. They found the depot, a long, low building whose roof had sagged in the middle, its door hanging from a single rusted hinge. Inside, the air was heavy with the smell of decay, rot, and time. It was a tomb of forgotten work, broken wagon wheels, rotted leather harnesses, and the collapsed staves of dozens of barrels lay in a chaotic jumble. They searched, kicking through the debris, their hope dwindling with the fading light. The drizzle outside turned into a steady, drumming rain. It's no use, Thatcher said, his voice raw with frustration. They're all rotted away. He kicked at a pile of collapsed staves, sending rotten wood flying. His boot connected with something hard, something that didn't give. It made a dull, metallic clang. He knelt, pulling away the debris. It was an iron band, thick and black with rust. From one of the massive water barrels, he worked it free from the mud and rotting wood. It was heavy in his hands. With the sleeve of his coat, he rubbed furiously at the rust. The drizzle from the broken roof pattered down on his shoulders. Marin held her breath, slowly, like a ghost emerging from the grime. Letters appeared, faint, pitted, but unmistakable. A B, tucked inside it, a W and an R. It was the mark, the iron memory. Thatcher Boone stood up slowly. The heavy iron hoop in his hands, he held it like it was a shield. The rain dripped from the brim of his hat. He looked at Marin, his face streaked with mud and rain, and in his storm-gray eyes was something she had never seen before, a raw, silent, and profound admiration. She was exhausted, chilled to the bone, her lips cracked from the wind. She looked at the iron brand, then back at him. A small, weary smile touched her lips. In the gray, dying light of the collapsing shed, with the storm breaking around them, that smile was as defiant and as bright as a forge fire in the heart of the night. Sunday morning found Cotton Mesa gathered at the church, not out of piety, but out of a desperate need for answers. Preacher Hale, standing at his pulpit, gave them absolution instead. "It is a grace agreement," he proclaimed, his voice rolling over their bowed heads. "In our time of need, the Silver Line has not forsaken us. They ask only for our trust, our cooperation, and in return, they have already begun their charity." As if on cue, Commissioner Broder and his men began moving down the aisles. They were not passing collection plates. They were handing out loaves of fresh, white bread, a luxury not seen in months. They were also handing out small, unmarked envelopes. "A stipend," Hale announced, as men opened them to find silver coins. "An advance on the wages to come, a show of good faith from the Silver Line Welfare Fund. Sign the agreement of grace, and accept this bounty. We are a community of faith, and this is our deliverance." The people, weary, hungry, and confused, took the bread. They felt the weight of the coins. They were being lulled, their anxieties soothed by the smell of yeast and the sound of Scripture. But as they filed out of the church, their bellies full of bread and their minds full of Hale's promises, they were met by a sight that stopped them cold. On the wide, sun-baked porch of the church, Marin Calloway had set up her school. The rough pine blackboard was propped against a pillar. Poppy Lane, Eli, and Asa were seated on the top step, their faces pale with thirst. There was no bucket of water. There was only a single, dented tin canteen, which Marin held. The crowd gathered, silent, watching. Marin unscrewed the cap. She poured a small amount of water, perhaps 2 swallows, into a tin cup. She handed it to Poppy. The child drank it slowly, her eyes closing, savoring every drop. She licked her lips, then looked at the canteen with a quiet, heartbreaking longing. Marin then poured the same meager amount for Eli, and then for Asa. When they were done, she upended the canteen. A few last, reluctant drops spattered onto the dry wooden planks of the church porch, evaporating almost instantly. The lesson was over. The water was gone. The image of the hungry children receiving their last drops of water on the very steps where the men were still chewing their free bread was a more powerful sermon than any Hale had ever delivered. It struck a chord of deep, guttural shame in the townsfolk. They looked from the children's parched lips to the bread in their own hands, and for the first time, it tasted like dust. Commissioner Broder saw the tide turning. He acted quickly. "This is a stunt," he boomed, striding onto the porch. "A cheap, theatrical stunt by a woman who would deny us all progress." He turned to his men. "Pass out the rest of the stipends. Double for any man who brings his own pledge sheet back signed by sundown." He was openly buying them now. Deputy Clive Morrow, his badge glinting, strode over to Thatcher, who stood watching from the edge of the churchyard, his face like carved stone. "Boone," Morrow said, his voice low and carrying an official chill. "The commissioner is filing a formal complaint. Your refusal to cooperate with the county's emergency water plan is a threat to the common good. We have the authority to close your spring, to seize it for the public interest, until this drought breaks." It was a declaration of war. Seizing Boone Hollow was the same as stealing it. Marin, having dismissed the children, was already walking, her skirts kicking up dust as she moved toward the county clerk's office. She found Jeannie Drum inside, pretending to file ledgers, her face a mask of terror. "They're all here," Jeannie whispered, not even looking up. Hale, Broder, They've been in and out of the vault all morning. They're preparing the forged agreement. Marin, they're going to announce it this afternoon. The invoice, Jeannie, Marin said, her voice urgent. The one I saw stamped, the Silver Line freight, 42 crates. Can you find the county's copy? Jeannie's hands trembled as she pulled a thick, green-bound ledger from a shelf. Shipping and disbursement. 1889. She ran her finger down the columns of neat cursive. Her finger stopped. My God, she breathed. She turned the book for Marin to see. There it was. An entry, dated 2 days prior. Received from Silver Line Freight 42 crates, special supplies. And beside it, the authorization for payment, drawn directly from the County Welfare Fund, the same fund Hale was lauding in the church. Where did they go? Marin asked. Not to the county warehouse, Jeannie said, her eyes wide. They were never checked in. The disbursement order, signed by Broder, directed them to a temporary storage site. She pulled a secondary docket. It's a depot, one leased by the Silver Line. Marin, they used our money, the county's emergency funds, to buy their own supplies. The blasting powder, the hardware, it's all there. It's embezzlement. It's theft. Copy it, Marin said. Copy it now. While Jeannie worked, her pen scratching frantically, Marin looked out the dusty window. She saw Thatcher. He was not arguing with Morrow. He was not shouting at Broder. He had walked away. He was striding toward his wagon, a look of focused, cold fury on his face. He was a man who had made a decision. He didn't return to the ranch. He drove to the lumber yard. Within an hour, Thatcher Boone was in the center of the town square, working with the furious, economical energy of a man building a fortress. He was not a talker. He was a doer. While Hale preached and Broder paid, Thatcher built, using new pine planks. He constructed a long, 20-foot trough, bracing it with sturdy legs. He lined it with canvas he'd brought from the ranch, making it watertight. At one end, he built a simple, ingenious filter, a crate filled with layers of clean river sand and charcoal from his own forge. The town gathered again, drawn by the sound of his hammer, which rang through the square with the clarity of a bell. When he was finished, he took his shovel. He walked to the edge of his property line, where his main irrigation ditch, full and flowing, ran parallel to the dry, cracked bed of the town's creek. He paused. This was the line, the one his father had died to protect, the one he had almost lost himself to. In his grief, he looked up, his gaze finding Marin, who was now standing on the steps of the clerk's office, the copied ledger page hidden in her skirt pocket. She met his gaze. He saw her, and she saw him. Thatcher Boone set his boot on the back of his shovel and drove it deep into the earthen bank. He dug a new channel. With steady, powerful movements, he diverted a portion of his own spring water, guiding it away from his fields and toward the town. The water, clear and cold, hit the dry town ditch, hissing as it touched the hot stones. It flowed down the gully, into the town square, and into the charcoal filter he had built. A moment later, clean, fresh water began to pour into the public trough. He threw his shovel down and turned to the silent, astonished crowd. There is water, he said, his voice rough and loud. There is enough, if it is managed. This isn't about a drought, it's about greed. A man stepped forward, then another. They cupped their hands, drinking from the trough. A woman brought her children. It was a baptism. The spell of the bread and coins was broken. The town, which had been willing to sell itself for a promise, was suddenly and powerfully on Thatcher Boone's side. Preacher Hale, seeing his congregation and his power dissolving, strode from the church, his face purple with rage. Broder and Morrow were right behind him. Blasphemy? Hale shrieked, pointing not at Thatcher, but at Marin. He knew where the true threat lay. You listen to him. A man led astray by her. His finger was like an accusation, pinning Marin where she stood. Who is this woman? A drifter, a rootless stranger who appears in our town and sows dissent. She aligns herself with our children. But what does she know of family? She has none She has no husband, she has no legacy, she is a barren woman, bringing nothing but discord. It was a mortal blow, delivered with the full, righteous fury of a desperate man. He had taken her deepest, most private scar and laid it bare for the entire town to see. The crowd went silent. It was the heavy, terrible silence of a public shaming. Marin felt the blood drain from her face. She saw the women look away, some in pity, most in judgment. She saw the men shuffle, embarrassed. She could have run, she could have hidden. Instead, she felt a cold, stark calm settle over her. She lifted her chin. She walked from the steps of the clerk's office, past the astonished faces, and stopped directly in front of Hale, her small frame dwarfed by his righteous posture. Her voice was not loud, but it was so clear that every person in the square heard it. "You are right, preacher." Hale, shocked by her audacity, faltered. "I am a stranger," Marin said, her gaze fixed on his. "And you are right, I cannot have children." The silence that followed was absolute, as thick and heavy as wool. She had not cried, she had not shrunk. She had simply taken his weapon and owned it, the stark, painful truth of it silencing the entire square. "A fever took that from me when I was a girl," she said, her voice steady. "I cannot bring life, as you say, so I have decided to preserve it instead. By teaching these children to read the contracts you would have them sign, by fighting for the water you would steal from them." Before Hale could form a reply, another shadow fell beside her. Thatcher Boone moved to stand shoulder to shoulder with her. He was not looking at Hale. He was looking at the townspeople, his neighbors. "If a family is only about blood," Thatcher's deep voice resonated, "then I am lacking, too. I left mine in a salt mine collapse. We all know what I lost." The town looked down, remembering his brother. Silas. "But if a family," Thatcher continued, his voice growing stronger, "is about who stays, if it's about who builds a roof, who digs a well, and who stands their ground to protect what's right, then I have more than enough." He looked at Marin, and in front of the entire town of Cotton Mesa, he placed his large hand on her shoulder. It was a claim, a statement, an alliance forged in iron. Marin felt the warmth and weight of his hand, and for the first time in her life, the cold, hollow place inside her didn't feel so empty. A wall she had lived behind for 13 years cracked. A rancher from the back of the crowd, emboldened by Thatcher's stand, shouted, "I say we have a hearing, a public hearing. Let's see Broder's grace agreement." "Aye," another yelled. "And let's see Thatcher's father's claim. Let's see the proof." The crowd surged, the word hearing passing from one to another. It was no longer a request. It was a demand. Commissioner Broder, seeing the coins and bread were now worthless, held up his hands, his politician's smile plastered back on. Of course, a public hearing. We are a government of the people. After all, he had to agree. But as the crowd cheered, Deputy Clive Morrow stepped forward, his hand on his revolver. "It'll have to wait," he shouted over the noise. "Wait? Why wait?" Morrow pointed to the sky. "The marshal is busy securing the low-lying farms. Look." Every eye turned upward. The sky, which had been a flat, oppressive gray, was now a roiling mass of bruised, purple-black clouds. The air had gone utterly still, heavy and electric, smelling of ozone and wet dust. As if on cue, a low, distant rumble of thunder rolled across the valley. "No hearing can be held in this," Morrow said, a note of triumph in his voice. "The town's safety comes first. We'll hold the community hearing after the storm passes." He and Broder shared a look, a delay, time to hide the ledgers, to move the crates, to shred the evidence. Thatcher looked at the sky, then at Marin. He knew what this meant. The storm wasn't just a delay. It was a deadline. The clouds overhead gathered, thickening, swallowing the last of the light. The wind began to moan, a low, rising shriek. The greatest storm of the season was no longer coming. It was here, and it was about to wash everything away or unearth every last secret. The wind came first, a low, mournful howl that grew into a physical force, pressing against the walls of the farmhouse. Then came the rain. Not in drops, but in solid, driving sheets that slammed against the world with the sound of 1,000 fists. Thatcher was already outside, a length of heavy rope in his hands. The big doors of the main barn, the ones that faced the open plains, were rattling in their tracks, threatening to tear loose. Marin, pulling on a heavy oilskin coat of Thatcher's that swallowed her whole, ran out to help him. The world outside was a maelstrom of noise and motion. The wind ripped the words from their mouths, making speech impossible. Rain, cold and sharp, found its way down her collar, plastering her hair to her skin in seconds. They worked in a desperate, silent ballet of necessity. He would brace a door with his shoulder, his muscles straining, while she wrestled with the stiff, wet rope, her smaller hands fighting to tie a knot that would hold against the storm's fury. The air was a chaotic blend of smells, the metallic, electric tang of the rain, the sweet scent of soaked hay, and the rich animal smell of wet leather from the harnesses hanging just inside the barn. They were working so close together, a single unit against the storm, that she could hear the frantic, powerful beat of her own heart in her ears, a frantic drum against the roaring wind. In the space of a single outstretched arm, their shared world had shrunk to this one vital task. A particularly violent gust tore a loose sheet of tin from the tack room roof. It cartwheeled through the air with a terrifying shriek and slammed into a fence post. Inside, Thatcher's voice was a raw shout, barely audible over the gale. The storeroom! He grabbed her arm, pulling her toward a small, sturdy outbuilding connected to the main barn. It was the old storage shed, built of thick pine logs, where they kept spare tools and sacks of feed. He shoved the heavy door open, and they practically fell inside, slamming it shut against the screaming wind. The silence that fell was sudden and absolute, broken only by the muffled drumming of rain on the roof and the howl of the wind finding the cracks in the walls. The air inside was cool and smelled of dry earth, cedar shavings, and old iron. A single oil lamp, which Thatcher had lit earlier, sat on a barrel, its flame dancing wildly in the drafts, casting their elongated, trembling shadows against the walls. Marin leaned against the door, her chest heaving, catching her breath. The rain had soaked through her dress completely. It clung to her like a second skin, the cold fabric heavy on her shoulders and back. Water dripped from the ends of her hair onto the packed dirt floor, making small, dark circles in the dust. Thatcher moved past her to brace the door with a heavy wooden bar, securing them inside their small, flickering sanctuary. When he turned back, he saw her shivering, her arms wrapped around herself. He said nothing, but moved to a small stack of horse blankets in the corner. He picked up the top one, a thick, clean wool blanket, and shook it out. "Here," he said, his voice quiet in the sudden stillness. He held it out to her, as she reached for it. Her damp dress, heavy with water, chose that moment to slip down her left shoulder, exposing the smooth, pale curve of her skin in the lamplight. He stepped forward to help her drape the blanket, and the calloused tips of his fingers brushed against her bare, wet skin. It was a touch as light as a falling leaf, but it landed like a lightning strike. They both froze. The world stopped. The roaring storm outside, the flickering lamp, the smell of the rain. It all faded away into a single point of contact. He didn't pull his hand back. She didn't flinch away. Her shivering stopped. He looked at her, his eyes dark and wide in the uncertain light. His gaze wasn't hungry or demanding. It was a question, deep and profound, asked without a single word. "Are you all right? Is this all right?" He was a man who had been locked away from human contact for so long that this simple, accidental touch was a revelation. Marin held his gaze. She saw the caution there, the deep well of loneliness, the fear of trespassing. And in that moment, she felt not fear, but a sense of homecoming. She gave a single, slow nod, a gesture so small it was almost imperceptible. It was her answer. Yes, it was all the permission he needed. He moved toward her, his approach as slow and deliberate as if he were gentling a frightened colt. Every inch was a question, his eyes never leaving hers, giving her every opportunity to turn away. He raised his hand, not to touch her face, but to gently push the heavy, wet sleeve of her dress a little further down, clearing the path to her shoulder. He lowered his head. He didn't kiss her lips. He pressed them, warm and firm, against the cool, damp skin of her shoulder. It was not a kiss of passion. It was a kiss of promise. It was solid, grounding. It tasted of unspoken sorrows and a deep, anchoring strength. It said, "I am here. You are safe." His breath was warm against her skin as he whispered, the words a low vibration that seemed to travel straight to her heart. "Don't stop." It was not a command. It was a plea, a request to stay in this one, perfect, fragile moment, suspended between the storm without and the storm within. As if in response to his touch, the wet fabric of her dress slipped further, the weight of the water pulling it down. Marin's hands came up instinctively, not to push him away, but to pull the wool blanket higher, covering herself. His own large hand came to rest over hers, helping her hold the blanket in place. He was not trying to remove the barrier. He was helping her build it. Their eyes met over the rough edge of the wool. A silent understanding passed between them, one of respect, of tenderness, of a boundary she had set and he would not cross. He straightened up, and with a gentle pressure on her arm, drew her forward. They came together in a slow, deep embrace. The thick wool blanket caught between them. Marin rested her head against his chest. It was solid, unyielding, a wall against the world. She could feel the steady, powerful rhythm of his heart beneath her ear, a slow, thudding drum that was infinitely more reassuring than the frantic one in her own chest. She closed her eyes, and they stood like that for a long time, simply holding each other. The drumming of the rain on the roof became their music. Their breaths began to synchronize, his deep and slow, hers shallow and quick at first, then gradually deepening to match his. Every movement was a slow conversation. When his hand moved from her arm to the small of her back, pressing her closer, her hand tightened its grip on his shirt, telling him to stay. A brilliant, blue-white flash of lightning illuminated the shed's interior, followed an instant later by a deafening crack of thunder that shook the very ground. Marin jumped, a small, startled gasp escaping her. His arms tightened around her instantly, a protective, reflexive gesture. He lowered his head until his forehead rested against hers. "It's all right," he murmured, his voice a low rumble against her hair. "I'm here." They stayed like that, forehead to forehead, breathing the same air. He tilted his head, and his lips, soft and hesitant, brushed against her temple. It was a gesture of pure comfort. Then he kissed the high curve of her cheekbone, and then the delicate line of her jaw, just below her ear. Each touch was soft, chaste, an exploration not of her body, but of her presence. They were acts of reverence, of discovery, of a man relearning a language he thought he had long forgotten. Tucked into the safety of his arms, with the storm raging and his heartbeat a steady presence beneath her ear, Marin felt the walls she had so carefully built around her own heart begin to crumble. She whispered into the rough fabric of his shirt, her voice small and tight with a lifetime of fear. "I'm afraid of being left behind." It was the simplest, truest thing she had ever said. Thatcher held her, his hand moving to gently cup the back of her head, his fingers tangling in her damp hair. He held her as if she were the most precious, fragile thing in the world. He waited a long moment before he answered, and when he did, his voice was thick with an emotion she couldn't name. "I'm a man who comes home. Marin," he said, his voice a raw, sworn oath. "Not one who leaves." It was the promise she hadn't known she was waiting her whole life to hear. It wasn't a promise of forever, or of happiness. It was a promise of presence, of staying. They stood there, locked in that embrace, as the storm reached its zenith. A furious, violent gust of wind hit the small shed, rattling the door in its frame and shrieking through the eaves. The fragile flame of the oil lamp on the barrel guttered, jumped, and then, with a final, soft hiss, was extinguished. The shed was plunged into an absolute, comforting darkness. It was a darkness that held no fear, only the sound of their breathing and the drumming of the rain. a darkness that kept the secret of two lonely hearts, finally, tentatively, finding their way home. Outside, Cotton Mesa was drowning in the storm, but inside the small, dark shed at Boone Hollow, something quiet and resilient had just taken root. The intimate darkness of the shed was shattered by a sound that was not the storm. It was a human scream, thin and terrified, carried on the wind. "The levee God Almighty, the Boone levee is going." Thatcher was moving before the words finished. The brief tenderness of the last few minutes instantly forged into a cold, hard purpose. He grabbed the heavy iron hoop, the 1864 water right that he'd left leaning against the wall. He snatched his sledgehammer from the tool rack. "Stay here," he yelled at Marin. "The church," she yelled back, her mind instantly calculating. Poppy, the town is in the church. He understood. The Boone levee, high on the ridge, held back the main creek. If it breached, the deluge would follow the natural contours of the valley, surging down the dry gully that ran straight through the center of Cotton Mesa. The church, built on what was usually high ground, was directly in its path. He didn't waste another word. He burst from the shed into the roaring chaos. Marin was right behind him. They split without a glance. He ran toward the levee, his long strides eating up the muddy ground. She ran toward the town, toward the children, her borrowed coat flapping wildly. Thatcher arrived at the levee to a scene of terror. The earthen dam, pounded by hours of relentless rain, was failing. Water was not just seeping, it was pouring over the top in a muddy cascade, and a V-shaped notch near the center was widening with every second, the earth melting away. A few ranchers were there, staring, mesmerized by the disaster. Helpless. "Get moving," Thatcher roared, his voice a physical blow against the wind. "The livery bales, any hay bales you can find, sandbags, bring them now." He didn't wait. He waded into the knee-deep, sucking mud at the base of the breach. He held up the heavy iron hoop, the BWR 1864, like a standard. "My father built this," he shouted to the men. "It held the water then. It'll hold it now." He jammed the iron hoop into the breach as a temporary frame, a desperate, symbolic act. He began driving stakes with the sledgehammer, the clang of steel on wood a rhythmic, defiant heartbeat against the storm's roar. The men, broken from their paralysis by his action, scattered to obey. Marin reached the church just as the bell began to toll. Not in warning, but in sheer panic. Inside was chaos. People were weeping, praying. Water was already pooling on the floor, seeping under the heavy oak doors. She saw the matron, Mrs. Gable, trying to comfort a half-dozen children, including the Miller twins. Near the altar, Mrs. Gable. Marin's voice cut through the noise, sharp and clear. The voice of a teacher taking command of an unruly classroom. "Get them onto the pews. Now count their hands, keep them together." She scanned the room, her eyes moving, counting. "Eli Asa hold Mrs. Gable's skirt." Her eyes kept searching. "Where is Poppy?" I don't know," the matron cried. She ran out. I thought she was looking for you." A cold dread seized Marin, but she had no time for it. She had to secure the children who were here. She was a general on a battlefield of pews and panic. "Everyone, stay calm, stay away from the walls." As she organized the retreat to higher ground, she saw a shadow slip out the side vestry door. It was Deputy Clive Morrow. He wasn't helping. He was leaving, and he was moving with a purpose, hunching against the rain, heading not toward the levee, but toward the headgate of the new ditch Thatcher had dug. Marin knew instantly. Sabotage. He was going to break the diversion gate, overload the channel, and ensure the levee did break, turning Thatcher's act of charity into the instrument of the town's destruction. "Stay here," she commanded the matron, and ran back out into the storm. She caught up to him at the head gate. He had a shovel and was already digging furiously, trying to collapse the bank. "Morrow, stop!" she screamed over the wind. He spun, his face a mask of desperation and malice. "Get out of here. Calloway, this is county business. I'm relieving the pressure." "You're lying," she shrieked, grabbing his arm, her grip surprisingly strong. The man who had shoved a child recoiled from the fury in her face. "You're trying to flood him out. You're trying to destroy the town's water supply." A few of the ranchers, having heard the commotion, ran over. "What's going on?" "He's destroying the ditch," Marin yelled, pointing. "Thatcher's ditch. He's trying to break it. He's destroying public property." The men looked at Clive, then at the ditch flowing with clean water, and they understood. This was the man who worked for Broder, the man who wanted them to sign their rights away. They closed in, forming a silent, menacing circle. Clive dropped the shovel. He was trapped. Back at the levee, Thatcher was losing. The hay bales were dissolving into mush. The breach was widening. "Rope," he roared. "We need to anchor it." Mr. Boone. A small, soaking wet figure appeared at his elbow, holding a coil of lariat. It was Poppy. She was shivering, covered in mud, but her eyes were fierce. I grabbed this from the barn. I can tie a knot. Mr. Boone Marin taught me a hitch." Thatcher's heart stopped. He wanted to scream at her, to send her to safety, but there was no safety. There was only the work. "Here," he yelled, grabbing a small, overturned watering trough. "Tie it to this stake, a fast hitch, like she taught you go." He threw himself into the torrent, using his own body as a block, while the small, 8-year-old girl, her fingers blue with cold, expertly tied the knot that would hold their small, desperate boat in place. The rain hammered them, punching their faces, the mud sucking at their boots. But together, the broken man and the orphaned child held the line, and the levee, groaning under the strain, held. It was in that moment of fragile victory that the sky tore open. A bolt of lightning, white-hot and blinding, struck the livery stable not 50 yards from the church. The sound was not thunder. It was an explosion. The dry, century-old hay in the loft ignited instantly. The roof erupted in a sheet of flame. Marin, having left Clive to the ranchers, saw it. "No!" she screamed. A primal thought cut through her panic. Mossy Belle, her horse, the sturdy mare that had carried her to Cheyenne, the one thing in the world that was truly hers. "Marin, no, it's too late," a rancher shouted, but she was already running. She ripped open the side door of the stable. The air was thick with smoke, the sound of screaming horses deafening. She saw Mossy Belle in her stall, kicking, wild-eyed with terror. "Marin!" Thatcher's roar was animalistic. He had seen the fire from the levee, seen her run in. He left the dam, now in the rancher's control, and sprinted, his lungs burning. Marin reached the stall, fumbling with the hot metal latch. She got it open, grabbed the mare's halter. Come on, girl." The main roof beam above her, charred and groaning, cracked. "Marin!" Thatcher hit her. He didn't push her. He tackled her. A full body slam that drove her out of the stall and onto the muddy ground outside. He twisted in the air, landing on top of her, his own heavy oilskin coat shielding her head and body as the entire livery roof collapsed inward in a volcano of sparks, cinders, and fire. They lay tangled in the mud, him on top of her, the world a chaos of hissing rain, crackling fire, and shouting men. The horse, Mossy Belle, bolted past them, wild but safe. He pushed himself up onto his elbows, his face inches from hers. He was covered in soot, his hat gone, his hair plastered to his skull. She was staring up at him, her eyes wide with shock. You fool," he breathed, his chest heaving. You're heavy," she whispered. And then, surrounded by the wreckage, the rain, and the shouts, they both began to laugh. It was not a sound of humor. It was a hysterical, breathless, gasping sound of pure, unadulterated relief. The sound of two people who had faced death and chosen life. The storm, as if defeated by the climax, began to break. The wind died to a moan. The rain lightened to a steady drizzle. Dawn was painting the bruised sky in shades of gray. The town slowly emerged, blinking. The fire was already being doused by the downpour. The levee had held. Thatcher stood, pulling Marin to her feet. He was still holding the sledgehammer. The iron hoop lay where he had first jammed it into the mud, a forgotten relic. The crowd gathered, drawn by the new silence. Jeannie Drum was there, her face pale. Preacher Hale was there, his fine coat soaked and ruined, his face a mask of pious concern. Thatcher walked to the hoop. It was caked in mud. He looked at Hale, at the crowd, then at Marin. He hefted the sledgehammer. He didn't strike the hoop. He tapped it. Clang! The vibration and the sheeting rain shook the mud loose. He tapped it again. Clang! The letters, scoured clean by the water and the vibration, shone in the watery gray light. BWR 1864. They were clear, deep, and undeniable. Boone Water Rights, a rancher whispered, reading it aloud. It was a public acknowledgement. The evidence had been witnessed, photographed by the collective memory of the entire town. "This is madness." Preacher Hale stepped forward, his voice losing its unctuous charm, cracking with desperation. "This proves nothing. We must have order. In this time of crisis, we must follow the county order. Preacher." Jeannie Drum's voice was suddenly cold and hard. Her fear had been burned away in the long night. "Or this," before Hale could react. She plunged her hand into the sagging, heavy pocket of his ruined broadcloth coat. Her fingers closed around something hard. She pulled it out. It was the embossed county seal, the original 1864 die, heavy and official, still bearing a faint smudge of Broder's forgery ink. She held it up for all to see, then let it drop with a heavy thud into the mud at Hale's feet. Hale's face turned the color of ash. Clive Morrow, seeing his superior exposed, made his choice. He turned and ran. He bolted for the alley between the church and the smoldering livery. He didn't make it 5 feet. He tripped over one of the sandbags, left there by the ranchers. He fell hard, sprawling face first into the mud, before he could even push himself up. 2 of the ranchers he had threatened were on him. One of them uncoiled the lariat from his hip. With quick, practiced motions, they bound the deputy's hands behind his back. It was rough, efficient, and final. Justice. Frontier style, in the center of the chaos. Marin stood, shaking from cold and adrenaline. A small body slammed into her. Poppy, having run from the safety of the levee, threw her arms around Marin's waist and buried her face in the soaked, muddy fabric of her dress. "You're safe," Marin whispered, her arms closing around the child, holding her tight. Thatcher walked over to them. He was streaked with mud, soot, and exhaustion. He looked at Marin, holding the child who was not hers by blood. He looked at the smoking ruins of the stable, the breached but holding levee, the bound deputy, and the ruined preacher. He slowly, deliberately, placed his large, steady hand on the small of Marin's back, his thumb rubbing a small circle. It was a quiet, possessive, and infinitely tender gesture. A moment of stillness in the heart of the wreckage. They were not a family born of paper or law. They were a family forged in the night, by fire and water and a refusal to be washed away. The Blue Lantern saloon had been scrubbed clean by the storm. The flood had breached the doors, leaving a clean, damp scent of scoured wood and wet earth, washing away the lingering smell of stale beer and regret. Now, in the watery afternoon light, it was serving as a courthouse. The long poker tables had been pushed together to form a single, imposing bench. At its head sat Marshal Lute Granger, a man whose authority came not from a robe, but from a pair of steady, clear eyes and a reputation for unswerving fairness. His face was a roadmap of hard trails and long suns. Beside him, Jeannie Drum sat with a fresh ledger and a sharpened pen, her posture no longer timid, but precise and official. She was the keeper of the record. The town filled the rest of the chairs, their faces scrubbed clean of yesterday's panic, replaced now by a solemn, watchful gravity. They were not a mob. They were a jury. Commissioner Broder and Preacher Hale sat on a bench to the left, their fine clothes ruined, their expressions a mix of indignation and fear. A shackled Clive Morrow sat between 2 grim-faced ranchers, his gaze fixed on the floor. Marshal Granger didn't bang a gavel. He simply placed his heavy, worn hand flat on the table. The sound was enough. The room fell silent. "This is a community hearing," Granger said, his voice a low, even baritone that carried to every corner. "We're not here for fancy lawyering. We're here for the facts. The floor is open." He looked at Marin and Thatcher, who stood together. "You brought the complaint. You may speak." Marin stepped forward. She was not the desperate woman who had arrived in Cotton Mesa weeks ago. She was composed, her voice steady. In her hands, she held the copied ledger pages Jeannie had given her. "Marshall Granger, members of the community," she began. "Preacher Hale and Commissioner Broder have spoken at length about the Silver Line Welfare Fund. They have been generous with bread and with coin." She let that hang in the air for a moment. "This," she said, laying the first page on the table, "is the county disbursement ledger. It shows a payment, authorized by Commissioner Broder, from the Welfare Fund to the Silver Line Freight Company." She then laid a second paper beside it, a copy of the freight invoice she had seen Deputy Morrow sign. "And this is the invoice for goods delivered, 42 crates of special supplies. The numbers match, the payment authorization matches." She looked up, her gaze sweeping across the faces of the townspeople. "The Welfare Fund. Our emergency money was not used to buy food for us. It was used to buy hardware and blasting powder for the railroad." A low, angry murmur rippled through the saloon. It wasn't just about water anymore. It was about theft. "The invoice is a forgery," Broder blustered, half rising from his seat. "The numbers," Marin said, her voice cutting through his, "are as straight as a well-driven fence post. Jeannie Drum can attest to their authenticity." All eyes turned to Jeannie, who simply dipped her pen in the inkwell and nodded once. Her silent confirmation was more powerful than any shout. When Marin stepped back, Thatcher stepped forward. He said nothing. He carried the heavy, rust-pitted iron hoop from his father's water barrel. He walked to the makeshift bench and placed it down with a solid, definitive thud. The sound echoed in the quiet room. He ran his thumb over the faint, raised letters. "B-War 1,864 inches," he said, his voice low and rough. "My father, Cyrus Boone, had this brand made by Owen Pike. He put it on every barrel that carried water from our spring. He did it because he said iron remembers what paper forgets." He looked at the townspeople, his neighbors. "This town was built on promises, a handshake over a fence, a man's word. My father made an agreement with this county. That brand is the proof. It is a film reel made of metal. It proves that the water right is not a new claim. It is the foundation on which this town was built." He stepped back to stand beside Marin. He had presented his evidence. The rest was up to the town. Marshall Granger looked at the iron brand, then at Broder and Hale. "Your response," before they could speak. A small voice piped up. "Marshall, sir." Every head turned. Poppy Lane, holding Marin's hand, had taken a small step forward. She was trembling, but her gaze was fixed on the marshal. "Speak, child," Granger said, his voice softening. Poppy pointed a small, trembling finger at the bench where Broder's men, now looking very uncomfortable, were sitting. "Those men, the ones who work for Mr. Broder, they pushed me." The room became so still. It felt as if the air had been sucked out. "I had a ribbon," Poppy whispered, her voice gaining a bit of strength. "A blue one, for the fence, for asking for water. And they said I was trash, and they shoved me down, in the dirt." She looked up at the faces of the men and women of the town. Her small, tear-filled eyes were not accusatory. They were a question. They were a mirror, reflecting their own humanity back at them. In that moment, the hearing stopped being about water rights and ledgers. It became about a child, a dirty ribbon, and the soul of a community. Preacher Hale, seeing the tide of sentiment turning into a tidal wave against him, rose to his feet, finding his voice at last. "This is a travesty. We are allowing the testimony of a vagrant woman and a hysterical child to overshadow the word of God. The scripture tells us to be charitable, to welcome progress." Wham! Marshall Granger's palm hit the table, a sound like a gunshot. "Preacher!" the marshal said, his voice dangerously quiet. "In this room, today, we read county law first and scripture second. Sit down." Hale, his face the color of spoiled milk, sat. Granger turned his cold gaze on Broder. "Commissioner, you claim the ledger is a forgery. You claim the iron brand is a relic. What do you have to say about the 42 crates of supplies?" Broder, cornered and sweating, tried to bluster. He laughed, a short, ugly sound. "A clerical error. A misunderstanding. The county often stores supplies for private contractors. It's a matter of convenience. Why? I personally inspected the manifest for that batch myself on the night of the 11th. Everything was in order." He sat back, a smug look on his face. He believed he had found his escape. From the clerk's table, there was a soft, dry rustle of paper. Jeannie Drum had not looked up. She had simply turned a page in her ledger. "Marshal," she said, her voice clear and calm. "Speak, Miss Drum." "According to the county receiving logs," Jeannie said, her finger tracing a line on the page, "there was no Silver Line shipment received on the 11th. The depot was closed. There was no freight delivery to Cotton Mesa that night at all." She looked up, her quiet, honest eyes meeting Broder's. "I'm afraid the commissioner must be mistaken about what he inspected." It was the final, fatal blow. Broder had been so intent on creating a lie, he had forgotten the simple, recorded truth. He had tied the noose himself. He slumped on the bench, his face slack, the bluster gone, leaving only the hollow shell of a defeated man. Marshal Granger let the silence hang for a long moment, allowing the weight of the truth to settle on the room. Then he stood. "This hearing is concluded," he announced. "The findings are as follows." He pointed at Broder. "By the authority of this community, your assets are hereby frozen, pending a full investigation into the embezzlement of county funds. You are removed from the office of commissioner, effective immediately." He turned to Hale. "You have abused your pulpit and your position of trust. You are stripped of your clerical authority within this county. I'd advise you find a new town to preach in." His gaze fell on Clive Morrow. "You are stripped of your badge and will be transported to Cheyenne to stand trial for dereliction of duty, conspiracy, and assault. Finally," he looked at Thatcher, "the reconciliation agreement of 1864 is found to be valid and binding. The water rights of Boone Hollow are hereby recognized in perpetuity." A great, collective sigh of relief went through the room. "Furthermore," the marshal continued, "in light of the commissioner's failings, the matter of water management falls to the people." A rancher stood. "I make a motion. We form the Cotton Mesa Water Cooperative. All ranchers who need it can draw, and we'll all contribute to the upkeep of the levee and the ditches." "Seconded," another voice called. "All in favor?" Granger asked. A forest of hands went up. "The motion passes." The first rancher was still standing. "I make another motion, that Marin Calloway be appointed to the board of this cooperative, as the keeper of the class and the creek." The title was strange, unofficial, but everyone understood it instantly. She was the one who had taught them, and the one who had fought for their water. Hands went up again, faster this time, more certain. Marshal Granger nodded, a faint smile touching his lips. He looked at Thatcher. "The county owes you for the damages to your livery, Boone, and for this trouble. Do you have a request for compensation?" Thatcher Boone did not look at the marshal. He did not look at the ruined men on the bench. He looked at Marin. He saw the faint blush on her cheeks at her new, strange title, the strength in her spine, the future in her eyes. "We don't need compensation, Marshal," Thatcher said, his voice low and steady, meant for the whole room, but his eyes only for her. "We just need everyone to still be here when the rain stops." The sound that filled the saloon was not a wild cheer. It was not a roar of victory. It was a deep, sustained applause, a sound that was thick and warm and comforting, like a well-worn wool coat being wrapped around the shoulders of a town that had just survived the winter of its soul. The days that followed the storm were born of a different world. The sky, scrubbed clean by the rain, was a high, brilliant blue. The air smelled of damp earth and new beginnings. At Boone Hollow, the yard was a patchwork of golden hay bales, unrolled and spread out to dry in the generous sun. The ranch was no longer a silent, solitary outpost. It had become the heart of the town's recovery. The water filter Thatcher had built in the town square now had a twin in his own yard, a more permanent version made of stone and fresh-cut pine. It was here that the children of Cotton Mesa came, with the orphanage temporarily closed for repairs and Mrs. Gable overwhelmed. Boone Hollow became their sanctuary. They treated the filter trough like a grand fountain in a city square, splashing in the cool, clean overflow. Their laughter a sound the Hollow had not heard in a generation. Marin's school moved from the church steps to the wide, welcoming porch of Thatcher's farmhouse. The old pine plank blackboard, which had survived the storm, was now rubbed with linseed oil until it glowed with a soft sheen. The alphabet she drew upon it seemed to stand straighter, the letters leaning into the gentle breeze as if eager to be learned. One afternoon, Marin wrote a series of simple words for Poppy to practice: cat, sun, barn, run. Poppy, her brow furrowed in concentration, painstakingly copied them onto her small slate. Then, without prompting, she wiped the slate clean and began to sound out a new word, her small finger tracing the letters in the air before committing them to stone. H-O-M-E. She held the slate up for Marin to see. The letters were wobbly, the E backwards, but the word was a perfect, four-sided structure. It was a foundation. Marin's breath caught in her throat. She looked from the child's proud, hopeful face to the open door of the farmhouse behind her, and for the first time, the word did not feel like a question, but an answer. Thatcher was changing. Too, the stone of his grief was being worn smooth by the constant, gentle friction of this new life. He was learning to laugh, not the short, rough chuckle she had heard in the barn, but a full, deep sound that started in his chest and seemed to surprise him every time. He took to bringing out provisions for the school. One day, it was a plate of cornbread from the oven, the edges a little too dark, the center a little too crumbly. He didn't offer it to the children. He presented the plate directly to Marin with a solemnity that was almost comical. "For the teacher," he said, his eyes not quite meeting hers, "to see if it passes inspection." Marin took a piece. It was warm, tasting of corn, smoke, and a man's earnest, clumsy effort. "It's very good," she said, her voice serious. "But perhaps a minute less in the oven next time." A slow smile spread across his face, a genuine, unguarded thing. "I'll make a note of it." And then he laughed, that new, rich sound rolling across the porch, and Marin found herself laughing with him. A shared, simple joy that was more intimate than any touch. It became their ritual, a quiet, fumbling courtship conducted over slightly burnt offerings and shared smiles. The nights were different now, too. The house was no longer hollow. It was full. After the children were picked up by their families, or the matron, a quiet, comfortable domesticity would settle over the farmhouse. The evenings were spent by the hearth, the fire casting a warm, flickering glow. One night, as Marin was mending a tear in one of Poppy's dresses, she found herself telling him about a dream she used to have as a girl, long before the fever. "It was always the same," she said, her voice soft, her eyes on her needlework. "A kitchen, not a large one, but warm. There was always a kettle on the stove, just beginning to whistle, and by the hearth, a pair of muddy boots, steaming in the warmth, and a hook on the wall where a wet coat was hanging." She paused, her needle still for a moment. It wasn't a dream about a man or a child. It was a dream about a place where someone came in from the rain and knew they were home. Thatcher sat across from her, cleaning a piece of harness, the firelight playing on his strong hands and rugged face. He didn't say a word. He just listened, his attention so complete, so absolute. It felt like an embrace. He was not just hearing her words. He was hearing the hymn of her deepest, simplest longing. The next afternoon, when Marin came inside to start supper, She found him on his knees by the stove. He was hammering. He had fashioned a small, sturdy rack from a piece of smooth sanded cedar, with 3 carved wooden pegs. He was mounting it on the wall, right beside the hearth, in the exact spot a person coming in from the storm would stand to warm themselves. He drove the last nail home with a final, definitive tap. Each blow had felt like a word, a sentence in a language he was better at speaking with his hands. He stood and wiped his hands on his trousers, looking at the rack, then at her. He didn't need to explain. Stay. The word was hammered into the very walls of the house. In return, Marin decided his mended work coat was no longer sufficient. She took his measurements while he stood unnaturally still. His arms held out awkwardly from his sides. Using a bolt of fine white cotton she had been saving, she began to sew him a proper shirt. She worked on it at night, by the fire, the soft hiss of the thread, a quiet answer to the sound of his hammer. When it was finished, she asked him to try it on. He emerged from his room looking transformed. The shirt fit his broad shoulders perfectly, the crisp white collar standing starkly against his tanned skin. It was the shirt of a landowner, of a community leader, not just a solitary rancher. "It's fine," he said, his voice gruff with an emotion he couldn't name. "The collar," she said, stepping closer. "Let me." She reached up to fasten the top button. Her fingers, deft and sure, brushed against the rough stubble on his jaw. The touch was electric, a spark of domestic familiarity that was utterly new. He stood perfectly still, his gaze locked on her face. She looked up at him, her work finished. A slow, quiet smile bloomed on her face, and after a moment, he returned it. It was a smile of deep, shared contentment, a silent acknowledgement of the new shape of their lives. That evening, a celebratory mood took hold. Someone in town had repaired an old fiddle, and the sound of music drifted up to the hollow on the evening breeze. "I don't suppose," Thatcher began, his voice hesitant, "that you know how to waltz. I know the steps." Marin replied with a smile. "Whether my feet remember them is another matter." He pulled the kitchen table to the side, clearing a small space on the worn, creaky floorboards. He held out his hand, a formal, almost courtly gesture. She placed her hand in his. His was large, rough, and warm. Hers was small and calloused, but it fit inside his as if it were made to be there. He put his other hand on her waist, and she rested hers on his shoulder. They began to move. Their steps were clumsy, their rhythm off. He was used to the earth, not a dance floor, and she was used to a sewing machine's pedal, not a partner. They bumped into each other, trod on each other's toes, and stopped, laughing. "You're a terrible dancer. Thatcher Boone," she said, her eyes sparkling. "You're not much better. Marin Calloway," he retorted, his own eyes crinkling at the corners. Their steps were all wrong, but their laughter was perfectly in time. They tried again, slower this time, less a dance and more a simple, swaying embrace set to the distant music. A scruffy, dust-colored barn cat that Poppy had named Tinder, who had adopted the farmhouse as his own, wound his way around their feet, a silent, unimpressed audience of one. A few days later, Marshal Granger rode up to the hollow. He dismounted, holding a rolled-up official document tied with a ribbon. "The cooperative is official," he announced, handing the paper to Marin. "The founding charter. It just needs the board members' signatures to be filed." Marin unrolled it. It was a beautifully written document, penned in Jeannie Drum's perfect cursive. At the bottom were 3 lines for the founding board. 2 ranchers had already signed. The first line was blank, with a title written beside it, "Marin Calloway, Keeper of the Creek." She took the pen Jeannie had sent with the marshal. Her hand was steady as she signed her name, her new name, her true name, on the document that bound her to this land, to this water, to this community. That evening, as the sun was setting, Marin saw Thatcher by the tool shed. He was holding his favorite shovel, the one with the worn, smooth handle that fit his hands perfectly. He had a small knife in his other hand, and he was carving something into the wood at the end of the handle. She walked over, curious. He didn't hide his work. He held it out for her to see, carved deep into the worn ash. In simple, strong letters were her initials. MC. It was not a ring. It was not a jewel. It was something far more precious. It was a mark of ownership, of partnership, on the one tool that defined his life, the one he used to break the ground, to build the ditches, to plant the seeds. It was a promise made in wood and sweat, a symbol of a life to be built together. She traced the letters with her finger, her heart too full for words. As the last light of the sun painted the ridge of sorrel in hues of purple and rose, they stood together on the porch, looking out over their valley. The lights of the town were beginning to twinkle on, warm and welcoming. The sound of children's laughter still seemed to echo in the air. Boone Hollow was no longer the silent, lonely ranch of a solitary man. It had become what Marin had always dreamed of, a porch light left on, a safe harbor for anyone who had ever found themselves lost in the great, lonely desert of the world. There was no bell, no organ, no stained glass window. The ceremony took place in the quiet afternoon, under the vast, rustling canopy of the old cottonwood tree behind the farmhouse, the one whose roots drank deep from the Boone Spring. A few long benches, borrowed from the now reopened church, were arranged in the dappled shade. A simple, rough-hewn table stood before them, laid not with lace, but with a clean linen cloth. On it sat 2 tin cups, polished until they shone, and a small, hand-carved wooden box. The whole of Cotton Mesa was there, their faces open and content. They were not merely guests. They were witnesses. The living foundation of this union, Poppy, wearing a clean blue dress with a new ribbon in her hair, the one Marin had saved, walked slowly down the makeshift aisle of flattened grass. She didn't carry a basket of flowers. Instead, she scattered a handful of bright, yellow cottonwood leaves, which danced and spun in the gentle breeze before settling on the ground. Marshall Lute Granger stood by the table, his hat in his hands, his weathered face softened by the occasion. He was not a preacher, but he was the moral and legal authority of their world, and his presence gave the proceedings a weight that no sermon could. Marin wore a simple dress of pale gray cotton she had sewn herself, and in her hair was a single, wild prairie rose. She walked toward Thatcher, her steps even and sure. He stood waiting for her, dressed in the crisp white shirt she had made him. He was not a man given to grand expressions, but as he watched her approach, his face held a look of profound, soul-deep reverence. He looked at her as a man, dying of thirst, would look upon the first, miraculous sight of a clear, cool spring. He had been wandering in a desert of grief for so long, and she was his water. She was his life. They stood before the marshal, hand in hand. "There are papers to sign," Granger said, his voice a low rumble. "And they will be signed. But in this place, a promise made before your neighbors is the only seal that truly matters." He opened the small wooden box on the table. Inside, nestled on a bed of dark velvet, were 2 rings. They were not gold or silver. They were simple, hammered copper bands, glowing with the warm, rosy light of the forge. Owen Pike, the blacksmith who had remembered the iron brand, had shaped them himself. Before Thatcher reached for the rings, he turned to Marin. The world seemed to fall away, leaving only the 2 of them under the rustling leaves of the cottonwood. He leaned in, and the crowd, understanding, seemed to hold its collective breath. He did not kiss her lips. He lowered his head and gently, with a tenderness that was now as natural to him as his own strength, he pressed a kiss to the warm curve of her shoulder, just as he had in the storm-tossed shed. His breath was a warm whisper against her skin. "Don't stop." It was their secret language, a vow whispered in the dark, now brought into the light. It was not a plea to continue a physical act, but a prayer for this feeling, this moment, this new life, to never end. Marin did not reply with words. She simply smiled, a slow, radiant smile of pure trust and love. With a small, deliberate movement, She let the light shawl she wore over her shoulders slide down her arm, a silent, symbolic act of surrender, of giving him not just her hand, but her whole heart, with no barriers left between them. The gesture was so quiet, so private in its public setting, that it made the heart ache with its simple beauty. Thatcher straightened, his eyes shining, and picked up the first copper ring. He took her left hand. His calloused thumb gently stroked her fingers. "Marin," he said, his voice low and rough with emotion. "I can't promise you a rainy season. I can't promise a full harvest, but I promise there will be clean water in your kitchen every morning. I promise you a warm fire and a roof that doesn't leak, and I promise you a man who will be here when you wake up." He slid the ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly. Marin picked up the other ring. She looked into his storm-gray eyes, now as clear and calm as a mountain lake. "Thatcher," she said, her own voice steady and true, "I can't promise you a child born of my blood." She spoke the words of her old scar, not as a source of pain, but as a statement of fact, a truth they both accepted. "But I promise that any child who comes to our porch will be safe. I promise that every child who sits in my class will be called by their name. And I promise you a woman who will be here when you come home." She slid the ring onto his finger. From the front bench, Jeannie Drum stood. She came forward, holding not a gift wrapped in paper, but a simple, dark wood frame. Inside, behind a pane of glass, was the official, certified copy of the 1864 Reconciliation Agreement, the embossed county seal clear and sharp at the bottom. She handed it to Thatcher. "For your home," Jeannie said softly, "so the past can always be a part of the future." The foundation of their fight, the legacy of his father, was now the centerpiece of their new life. Then another man, a rancher Marin recognized from the hearing, came forward with a newly carved plank of pine. Burned into the wood were simple, bold letters. It was a sign. "Water belongs to Cotton Mesa, kept by those who know how to stay." He handed it to Thatcher. "From the town," he said, "to hang on your gatepost." As if on cue, the sun, which had been hiding behind a scrim of high, white clouds, broke through, pouring a warm, golden light down upon them all. And from the town, faint but clear, came the sound of a banjo, the notes no longer clumsy and out of tune, but bright, rhythmic, and joyful. Someone had been practicing for a day worth remembering. The first day of the new school season at Boone Hollow was bright and warm. The porch was filled with more children than ever before, for their lesson. Marin wrote a single 7-letter word on the oiled blackboard. She had them practice it, their pieces of chalk squeaking on their slates. Later, she found Poppy sitting on the top step, carefully putting the finishing touches on her own slate. The letters were wobbly, tilting this way and that, but they were filled with a child's fierce, determined pride. B-E-L-O-N-G. Poppy looked up, her expression serious. She put her slate down and hugged Marin tightly around the waist. She looked up, her head tilted. "Marin," she asked, her voice small, "now that you're married to Mr. Boone, who are you to me?" Marin knelt, so she was eye to eye with the child. She brushed a stray strand of hair from Poppy's forehead. "I'm the one," she said, her voice soft but sure, "who will call you by your name every morning." It was the only promise that mattered, a promise of identity, of stability, of being seen, of being home. Poppy's face broke into a radiant smile, and she hugged Marin again, burying her face in her shoulder. That night, after the world had gone quiet, Marin and Thatcher stood on the porch. The distant, joyful music had faded. There was only the sound of the crickets and the soft sigh of the breeze through the cottonwoods. He held out his hand, and she took it. They didn't try to waltz, they just swayed, a slow, easy rhythm that was entirely their own. His hand rested on the small of her back, hers on the solid wall of his chest. Their synchronized breathing was the only music they needed. The wind, coming up from the valley, carried the sense of their life, the smell of dry hay, of cured leather, and from the kitchen window, the faint, sweet scent of freshly baked bread. From a distance, from the top of the ridge overlooking the valley, the Boone Hollow Ranch was a single, warm point of light in the vast, velvet darkness. The yellow lamplight in the window was like a watchful eye, guarding the peace within. You could see the silhouette of the open porch, a symbol of welcome. You could hear, if you listened closely, the gentle, constant murmur of the creek, the lifeblood of the land, flowing steady and true. And if you looked very, very closely, you could see two figures, swaying slowly in the dark, and a man leaning down to press a soft, lingering kiss on a woman's shoulder. It was just enough to make you smile, and to wish you could hear every story that was to come. Thank you for listening to our story. We'd love to know where you're tuning in from, so please drop a comment below and let's share our thoughts. To hear more tales from the frontier, please subscribe to our channel, Wild West Stories 1850, and give this video a like. And if you truly enjoyed this journey, please consider hitting the hype button to help this story reach more listeners like you.